Hello, welcome to lecture 10 of the Fiat Standard online course. Today's lecture is on Fiat Fuels, the topic of chapter 10 in the Fiat Standard. And in this lecture, we're going to discuss the impact of the fiat monetary system on the global fuel system and the energy market. So, as we discussed in the previous chapter, when it came to food, the 1970s was a decade of inflation and rising prices. And food prices rose significantly in the 1970s, and also, of course, energy prices rose significantly. And I think it's extremely important to understand what happened with energy markets back then, just like it is very important to understand what happened with food markets, because I think it's very difficult to make the argument that the changes that we have witnessed in these markets since then are unrelated to the monetary system and to the public policies that have been undertaken specifically and deliberately to bring about these outcomes, and that have been financed by the fiat monetary system. So when it comes to the market for food, we saw all the policies that promoted the production and the consumption of these horrible industrial foods that are causing problems. We saw why the policies were motivated and what the important benefit they provided for government was, that they understated the extent of consumer price increases by convincing people to use and consume goods that are cheaper to eat. And now we're going to see something very similar happen with energy. So, as with food, government attempted to fix the problem of rising prices by manipulating the market for oil rather than addressing its underlying monetary cause. Instead of reducing inflationary credit expansion and government spending, bureaucracy sought to find cheaper and better alternatives to oil. This is really how we can understand monetary policy and energy policy since the 1970s. Rather than stopping the inflation that was causing energy to become less affordable to people because people were losing the monetary energy they store in their money, and the monetary energy continued to buy them less and less dynamic and mechanical and kinetic energy in the form and heat energy in the form of oil and energy resources that are needed for that. And the reason for that was inflation, of course. So we find the same dynamic repeat itself, and we find the same dynamic of finding excuses for why the prices rise outside of monetary reasons. And in fact, a lot of modern macroeconomics is just simply about explaining inflation away without invoking monetary policy. So why was there an oil crisis in the 1970s? If you ask most fiat economists, they tell you it's because of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the pursuant Arab oil embargo. But this is nonsense. If you really study the history of energy markets in the 1970s, and there's a great book that I mentioned in this chapter, which is called Energy Aftermath, which I highly, highly recommend. It's an old book that's out of print, but you might be able to find it somewhere. But it's a really good book because it explains very, very well the commonly believed story in fiat circles that it was just this embargo that led to all of these crises in oil production and that created all these problems is just nonsense. First of all, the shortages started in 1972, so before the war had even started and before the Arab oil embargo. And in spite of the fact that there was an oil embargo, the amount of oil imports into the US did not drop because of the embargo, because oil is an extremely liquid commodity. And this is the thing that people miss, that if one producer of oil decides to boycott one consumer of oil, they can't stop that consumer of oil from buying oil from any of the many, many, many other producers of oil. So there are many other countries, many companies all over the world that are producing oil. And so the embargo did not starve the US of oil because they could just buy their oil from other places. It did cause some inconvenience because they had to negotiate new contracts and get rid of old contracts and switch suppliers effectively. But it did not cause a significant reduction in the quantity of oil that was imported by the US. There was no global supply chain crisis, which I think is very important to bear in mind considering what is going on today. And again, everything in this chapter I think is very useful to understand given the problems that we're facing with inflation with fiat today. So just like today, we're getting all of these explanations about why prices are rising, and it's all about supply chains and war and this and that and the other thing, and none of it is about monetary policy. It was the case in the 1970s, but before and after the embargo, prices were rising. And US imports did not decline because of the embargo. So the idea that this embargo was responsible for the rise in oil prices from around $2 a barrel in 1970 to around $30 a barrel in 1980 is completely fictitious. I mean, you could argue maybe for a few weeks there was a problem with the pricing for a bit that was exacerbated by the embargo, but the problem of rising prices of oil from $2 to $30 a barrel, this a 10-15-fold increase in the price of oil over the course of a decade, is not something that was caused by any particular supply shock. It was simply the devaluation of the currency. It was the currency losing its value. So this was extremely painful for particularly Americans, because Americans are some of the most heavy consumers of energy in the world. So the American economy is some of the most energy intensive. The average American individual consumes more energy than pretty much every other country in the world. And usually that's presented as if it's a bad thing. Most people say this as if it's a shame on the US. Then how dare you consume so much? I think it's a good thing for the US. I just wish the rest of the world could consume as much as the US and much more. And I wish the US could consume. I would like to live in a world in which everybody would consume 10x the amount of energy that they would consume today. I think that world would be much, 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 much better than what it is today. So usually this is presented in a negative light. I think it's a good thing. The more energy we provide to meeting our needs every day, the better our life is, the better our quality of life, the better everything that we want in life improves, because we're able to direct more and more energy toward meeting the needs that we want, toward satisfying and the ends that we have, and towards bringing about the physical changes in the world that we want to see to make our lives better. So we build houses and we keep ourselves warm in the winter. So the more energy we have, the better. But the more energy you have, the more sensitive you are to increases in the prices of energy. And that was the problem that Americans faced in the 1970s. Their lives had already become heavily reliant on cheap oil. They had big cars, they were living in large suburbs, they drove a lot, they had a lot of household appliances, much more than what the rest of the world had. The American house had dishwashers and fridges, continues to have more than the rest of the world has, I think. So you have all this heavy, expensive equipment that requires a lot of cheap energy in order to operate. And it's essential for the modern life. People are already moved into these houses in the end of the world in the suburbs, and because they have these cars, and they were spending a lot of energy on keeping those houses lit and running because they have cheap energy. Now, when the price of energy goes up significantly, that becomes a very seriously unpopular problem for people and for the politicians. So, again, just like with food, maybe we stop the inflation. That's the kind of sane solution. But then the fiat solution is, no, how about we just get people to consume cheap alternatives, and then we tell them that the cheap alternatives are better for them. Because of this, the US government essentially has made it its priority since the 1970s, since the establishment of the Department of Energy, to manage the transitions away from hydrocarbon fuels into what they call renewable fuels. And everything since then has centered around that. With fiat authority, we're going to just mandate that the world shifts away from fossil fuels and hydrocarbon fuels into these new energy sources. And the power of the government with a money printer has essentially been at war with the laws of thermodynamics and the basics of engineering. They want to force the world's engineers to build the world's current infrastructure without using the fundamental building block on which all of this infrastructure relies. So we're basically faced with this insane engineering problem where you're supposed to make all of the things that we have today. We want to give people a good quality of life with all of the electronics and machines and infrastructure that we have today. But we can't use the foundational technology that makes it all possible, which is high energy fuels, hydrocarbon fuels. That's what makes all of this possible. And without that, none of this is possible. But somehow this is, and I think people are going to, in the future, are going to look back at this as just the height of insanity, that we're giving trillions of dollars every year as a human race to this organization that is intent on taking away the technology that makes all of modernity possible. All of the technological improvements of the last 400 or 500 years, approximately all, rely on the introduction of high density energy sources into our life. Coal, and then oil, and then gas, and nuclear energy. All of these things over the last 500 years are what revolutionized everything in our life. Take that away, you take all of that away, you take away electronics, you take away the entire computer revolution. And somehow, it's viewed as a normal thing for the government to just say, yeah, let's just take this essential building block in all of this and replace it with other things. And let's just make it our most important obsession to figure out how to replace this very essential thing. The literal blood, well, not the literal blood, the figurative blood of the modern economy, the oil and the energy that makes everything possible in the modern economy. Let's take that away and try and build the modern economy, which for me is similar to saying, let's make apples, but let's get rid of apple trees. Let's make apples, but without having to have apple trees. And it's just insane, because if you want apples, you have to have an apple tree. And similarly, if you want any of the modern infrastructure that we have in this world, if you want computers, if you want internet, if you want cell phones, if you want Bitcoin, if you want all of the nice things that we have, you need hydrocarbon energy. There are no other ways of providing them. So better get used to it and come to terms with it. Either quit the hydrocarbons or stop complaining about them.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight computer, my favorite computer, because I love to work early in the morning, late at night, outdoors, and in the sun. But regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they can hurt your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen I could use to write, but never found a decent one. Now, a group of Bitcoiners have finally delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I have been using the Daylight computer for more than a year now, and I cannot recommend it enough. And it's led me to invest in the company. Now, they've introduced a new Daylight computer for kids. A calm computer to help your kids focus with no distractions, no mature content, no ads, no tracking, no social media, and no junk content. Daylight is the real low-time preference computer for you and your children. Check out my interview with founder Anjan Katta in episode 249 and go to daylightcomputer.com to see this amazing machine, or kids.daylightcomputer.com to see the kids version, and use code SAFE to get 10% off your purchase. With fiat money constantly debasing, preserving your wealth isn't an option or luxury. It's a financial and moral imperative. If you're familiar with my work, you know the only financial advice I ever give is to buy and hold Bitcoin for the long term. This has never failed anyone. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I strongly recommend using Swan, a group of hardcore Bitcoiners laser focused on making Bitcoin easily accessible. While most scramble to react to each new crisis, Swan private clients are already positioned in the only monetary asset with absolute scarcity, Bitcoin. Swan Private partners with families and institutions who share a principled conviction in Bitcoin as the foundation for multi-generational wealth. With concierge service, deep expertise, and uncompromising security, the Swan team helps clients exit the crumbling fiat system and secure their future in sound money. Today, Swan Private serves more than 5,000 high net worth clients who have purchased more than $4.5 billion of Bitcoin and put it into cold storage. If you're ready to move beyond the false promises of fiat, start your long-term Bitcoin strategy at swan.com/saif, SAIF.
But of course, that's not something that people in fiat world need to do, because they can continue to live in isolation from reality, because they have the ability to print money and basically try and buy the reality that they want. So, to avoid the rise in oil prices, the US government's fiat sought to ignore half a millennium of technological advancement and build the modern world using pre-modern solar, wind, and biofuel energy. For the first time in history, central planning the sources of energy humans use became viewed as a legitimate function of government. And it led to the emergence of large industries reliant on government subsidies, mandates, and subsidized credit to operate, while constantly making promises of achieving technical and economic success in a few years. I think people just don't understand the extent of this scam. You know, they hear about all of these new energy things that get promoted on the media, that, oh, in a few years we think we're going to be able to make something, you know, we're going to be able to run our grid 50% renewable or something like that. And I think these things are, realistic. All of these promises, in 3 to 5 years we're going to do this, and in 5 to 7 years we're going to replace all fuels with ethanol or whatever. These things have become an enormous industry since the 1970s. You know, if you look at the constant churn of noise that comes out of the renewable industry, it's the same noise, just continuously repeating. So since the 1970s, we've been hearing about how ethanol is going to revolutionize oil and replace oil. And since the 1970s, it continues to remain much more expensive to produce. It continues to be uneconomical. It continues to require enormous amounts of subsidies. And it continues to fail. And it continues to receive these subsidies. And it's the same thing with all of these alternatives. And it's just, for most people, they think, you know, the reasonable thing to assume is that engineers are going to work on this and figure out a solution to this problem, and then that problem is going to be solved. But there is a very, very, very convincing counter-argument, which is that there is no problem to be solved there. This is an imaginary problem. The problem was solved. You know, the problem of building modern technology was solved by bringing high-density fuels that are easily transportable and moving them all over the world, and using engines to utilize those fuels to bring in high amounts of power to produce the things that we need. That's how it was solved. So to try and solve the problem by getting rid of the solution means that you don't quite understand what the problem is. And these people just think, oh, if we just print money and hand it over to scientists, they can design the reality that we want. This is the way the world of fiat thinks of thermodynamics, basically. It's just something that is optional, that we can dictate by fiat, just like everything. You know, we should just pass a law that says we will have all of the modern technology that we have, but we will do it without oil. And if we just pass enough laws and give enough subsidies to enough engineers, then they're going to give us that. Thermodynamics be damned. The problem here is that hydrocarbons built our modern world. Their nature's cheap, powerful, and ubiquitous batteries. They have high power, they have high energy density per weight or area, and they are easy to transport. So a small amount of hydrocarbon fuel is able to produce a very large amount of power. You know, 1 small gallon of gasoline can allow your car to drive for hundreds of kilometers. And that's a very small amount of substance that you need to carry with you in order to move that car. So it's an extremely powerful technology. And at a very basic engineering level, having these extremely cheap, extremely portable, extremely powerful batteries is what allows our modern world to exist. You know, the reason you can have a TV and a camera and a laptop and all of these extremely amazing devices in your house, and the reason you can have a car, the reason you can drive the car, the reason we can have airplanes, the reason all of these things exist is because we have this technology for moving energy around everywhere in the world. So we just drill for oil one place, we pack it up in standardized barrels and containers, and it gets moved around, and then it finds its way near your house to provide you with the energy that you need for your car, or with the gas that you need for your power plant, or whatever form it takes. We need this highly mobile, highly powerful form of energy in order to have nice things. That's just the reality of it. And trying to get around that by just assuming we can just get rid of that and find alternatives that'll just give us the same thing is just delusional. It's insane. It's completely insane. We can't recreate that with wind or solar in a very, very fundamental way. It's impossible to recreate it because with wind and solar, you don't have these kind of batteries. You don't have that energy on demand. You only get the energy when the wind blows or when the sun shines, and then you can't get large bursts of energy that you need on demand. You need a big amount of energy right now for a factory to operate its very heavy machinery. How can you do that from very small quantities of wind over very long periods of time? You need to store them in a battery. But if we don't use nature's batteries, hydrocarbons, then you need to use artificial batteries, which is incredibly much, much, much more expensive. So the cost of electricity from natural gas or from diesel oil is in the range of 10-20 cents per kilowatt hour or something like that. The cost of electricity put through batteries is at least 10x that, possibly 20x that. Simply taking that same electricity, putting it through a battery and out of the battery. By running down the battery, if you amortize the cost of the battery over the time that you're running it, you're adding around 10x the cost of the battery. So we need these very cheap batteries, and the alternatives are extremely expensive. And of course, the very important point is that you can't make the alternatives without hydrocarbons. You can't have solar panels, you can't have wind turbines, and you can't have batteries without hydrocarbons. So the alternatives to hydrocarbons are the opposite. They are low power, and they are low energy density per weight or area, and they are immobile. So, for instance, and this applies in general to what are called alternative or sustainable or green or renewable fuels, whether it's wind or solar or biofuels, it's generally low amount of power that you can get out per unit of area. So, for instance, with solar, you need to deck out enormous amounts of land in order to produce small amounts of power. So that's extremely inefficient and, of course, extremely expensive. And extremely uneconomical because you need large amounts of areas of land, and then that means that these lands can't be used by people. So the energy is being produced away from where people are, and then you need to move people away from the solar panels in order for people to have their society and life. And so therefore you lose more in terms of the transportation. And so it's extremely expensive in terms of the land, and it's inefficient because of the cost of transportation. It's low power. You're getting very low amounts of power from the sunshine. It's not concentrated. So then you need to concentrate it in batteries, which is extremely expensive. And it's immobile. It's very difficult to take sunshine and put it on a car. Again, you have to do it through batteries, which are extremely expensive. None of that, of course, is going to deter our fiat world from trying. This book, Energy Aftermath, is a fascinating study of what happened in the 1970s when they tried to do this. The U.S. government made it its policy that there were 5 energy sources that they wanted to use to replace oil. And these were syn fuels, photovoltaics, biofuels, natural gas, and nuclear energy. And these 5 sources of energy were supposed to replace oil. And then they look at all of these and what happened to them. And I highly recommend the book because it's very, very applicable. It's exactly like what's happening today. Same story, same sources of energy. Some of them are gone. Nobody talks about them. So nobody talks about syn fuels anymore. But it's pretty much the same thing that you hear about all kinds of other energy sources. And then they all failed. So tons of subsidies and regulations and attempts to try and get this to become successful. It all keeps failing. And biofuels is the topic that I wrote my PhD on. It was an incredible failure, enormously expensive project where they just continue to hand out billions upon billions of dollars every year to corn farmers and agribusiness. And these agribusinesses continue to spend it extremely inefficiently and continue to go out of business, but continue to enrich their investors. It's a big scam. And, with nuclear and natural gas, the only two sources that could work, it was all because of regulation and fiat and all of that nonsense that hampered it from growing. What motivates all of this, what we find in all of these policies, is that government is essentially trying to reduce the demand for oil in order to reduce the prices, in order to reduce the pressure on the prices and prevent the prices from rising. And some cults believe humans are a burden on earth. This is a big element of this is anti-humanism. A big driver of this is there are a lot of people out there who believe that we are a burden on earth. Humans are a parasite and a burden on earth, and that the goal to strive for is an empty virgin earth without us, and that we should really stop being such a burden on earth. At the very least, stop industrializing, stop having all these extremely heavy machinery that are disfiguring earth and ruining it and filling it up with carbon dioxide. There is that, but there's also, of course, a lot of industries that have grown to benefit from this. So on the one hand, these are I think the three drivers of Fiat Fuels and the Fiat energy policies. On the one hand, government wants to reduce demand, to reduce prices, and some cults believe, and so we have government trying to get people to not use oil, and then you have all these religious people who are trying to get people to not use modern technology because it's bad for Earth, and then you have a giant industry of hucksters profiting from this, and that's the renewable energy industry, and it includes a lot of household name figures that you have grown to maybe love, maybe hate over the years. The interesting thing here is that how do you know that they're lying is because they change their lies, but their conclusions stay the same. When somebody continues to arrive at the same conclusion in spite of using completely different methods of reasoning, you can be pretty sure that they're really using motivated reasoning. Very interesting here that the conclusion to the problems of the world since the 1970s, since the move off the gold standard in 1971, gold exchange standard, I should say, since the move off gold in 1971, we went from we need to stop using oil because oil is running out and we don't have oil, to we need to stop using oil because there's too much oil and if we keep using it, we're going to destroy planet Earth. The two exactly opposite realities. I mean, you can't believe the two things. You can't believe that we are at once running out of oil and also we have too much oil. It's one of the two. It can't be both. So either we have too much oil or we're running out of oil. Initially, when prices of oil were rising a lot in the 1970s, the story was that we were running out of oil. But then when inflation subsided a little bit in the 80s, and prices of oil dropped down relatively, well, then somehow we weren't running out of oil. It no longer made sense to tell people, oh no, we're running out of oil, there's not going to be any more oil. But the hysteria continued, that we still need to run out of oil. The anti-oil and the anti-human element of this, even though the inflation pressure had subsided relatively in the 1980s, but the anti-human element of we need to stop burning oil and surviving and living because we are impacting Earth continued. And the special industries, the third one here, the large industries that benefit from this, they also continued to benefit and they continued to call for more of this in the 1980s. And so this industry continued and they shifted their rhetoric from there's not enough oil to there's way too much oil and we're going to burn all the oil and we're going to destroy the earth because we're burning so much oil. Suddenly we went from earth doesn't have enough oil for us to earth has so much oil for us that we are going to burn earth from how much oil we are going to burn. In both cases, we're just being delusional about the kind of size that we have compared to the rest of the planet. In both cases, I think it's delusional. In both cases, there's a price, there's a commodity, there's a cost of producing it, and there are damages that can be produced from it. And people are perfectly capable of figuring out these things, figuring out how to engineer and optimize those things in a way that achieves their ends and minimizes the damages and the losses. But the anti-oil hysteria continued in the 1980s, and then with the return of the inflation of the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, this is now being intensified further and further. So we're combining, oh no, there's inflation, so oil is going up, and we need to stop oil. But also, we're combining that with, if we keep consuming oil, we're going to burn the planet. And so we were running out of everything, and we were all going to die in the 1970s and the 1980s. We switched to, we're all going to die because we're consuming too much. The reasoning may change to its exact opposite, but the conclusion is the same. Apocalyptic hysteria, always. The constant in fiat science is the hysteria, because that's how you get funded. There's no evidence that there's any kind of crisis from CO2 levels rising. This is the key point. The notion that CO2 levels rising is a crisis is just a fundamentally ridiculous proposition. And there's absolutely nothing to support this idea that there is a crisis out there. You can agree or disagree about all kinds of little details about the mechanisms for how CO2 impacts the atmosphere, how we impact CO2 levels in the atmosphere, but there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that anything going on is some kind of crisis that is existential threat to us. And most importantly, nothing comparable to the kind of crisis that would ensue if we stop consuming the important and essential fuels that are truly essential to our living. So, where is this crisis they keep telling us about? Well, initially, people used to tell us that the crisis is in all the temperatures. The temperatures keep rising, and the earth is going to boil, and the oceans are going to boil. It's the infamous hockey stick story. But over time, it became clear that variation before industrialization was far larger than after industrialization. So there was a lot of hysteria. Usually, they'll show you a hockey stick where over the last a couple of hundred years, temperatures went up, and then the previous few hundred years, temperatures were very low. Of course, there's a lot of questions about the methodology behind that and how unreliable all of this stuff is. But by any stretch of the imagination, everybody can agree that the variation that we saw before industrialization, before the last 200 years, before we had reliable thermometers, before we had reliable records, the variation that existed before that far exceeds anything that we've seen so far. We know for a fact that somewhere above the Arctic tree line, trees used to grow. So today, there is a point at latitude around 60 or 70 or something like that. I'm not sure where exactly it is, but there is a tree line. There's a line north of which there are no trees. If you keep going north, it gets so cold in the pole, and the winter is so long that trees just don't grow. There are places where you just don't have trees, and that line is called the tree line. Now, in those places where we don't have trees, we know that there are trees, fossils there. So sometime in the past, trees used to grow there. So things were much warmer back there. How long ago this was, what temperature was there, is not a very easy thing to decide. And, there's a lot of literature on measuring ancient temperatures and ways of measuring it. We don't know, but we know for sure that there was a time in which the North Pole was a lot warmer than it is right now because trees used to grow there. So we've seen nothing like that kind of variation over the last 200 years. In fact, we've really basically seen no real variation. Initially, it was about temperatures, but then temperatures, over the last 20 years, we haven't really seen any serious increase in temperatures.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
Then we moved to ocean acidification. That was a big one. Oceans are going to turn acid, and that's going to destroy marine life. And there are details about why that turned out to be one big giant nothing hysteria. We also had sea level rises. For a long time, we've heard people say sea level rises, but we see now there are pictures of, we've had cameras for about 150 years now. So there are pictures of places like the Statue of Liberty and Sydney Harbour and all kinds of different beaches for 150 years. and the sea level is exactly where it was 150 years ago when somebody was taking that picture. You can compare the two pictures from the same position today, and you see the sea level is basically the same. It hasn't changed in 150 years. So what is it? Where is the crisis? Well, now we've reached the point where there's no clear explanation for why this is a crisis, but there is a consensus that everything bad is caused by the crisis. And we don't have any clear idea about what the causal mechanism is, and we don't have very strong evidence about what any of these causal mechanisms does and how it works. But everything bad is caused by carbon dioxide. This is the way the world works now. So there's a link in the book to a website where essentially the website has collected over the years hundreds of articles of things that are caused by carbon dioxide and climate change. And it's just amazing. Pretty much everything that you can imagine, all of it has been attributed to this increase in CO2 concentrations from 0.028 to 0.042. And this is just the way that Fiat science works. Fiat science works in a way where once the agenda has been set, then you can only be a scientist if you abide by the conclusions of the agenda. You can only toe the line. There is no dissent. There is no mechanism for changing track. There is no mechanism for having a free market test of the usefulness and effectiveness of any idea. So once everybody has decided, we need to get rid of fossil fuels, or once somebody has decided that we need to reduce meat consumption, there is no set of circumstances that can happen in the world that will cause the scientific establishment to change their mind on this in today's modern Fiat science. So since the 1970s, these people have been telling people to eat poison, and people have been dying and getting sick, and they still tell them to keep eating more poison. I mean, you have to be exceptionally stupid and or willfully, deliberately trying to not see what is in front of you because of your personal stake in it, to not see the connection between eating garbage and ill health, and to not question whether the recommendations that doctors and nutritionists are giving people are bad. But there's no mechanism for checking on that because we just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. We just keep repeating the same advice because there's no mechanism, there's no market test. So in a free market, if you had a free market in those ideas, anybody can publish any research that they want. People who listen to people who make good research benefit from it, and then the good research gets rewarded, and it gets more money, and it gets more resources, and it is able to answer more questions. And people who listen to bad research get punished for it. So there is a mechanism for correcting it because the financing comes from the market. So the students are going to go to the researchers who know how to make people healthy, and the customers who want to learn about nutrition are going to go to people who come up with scientific ideas that don't make you unhealthy and die young. But with Fiat, you completely sever this feedback mechanism because the money does not come from the customer. It doesn't come from the people who go to those schools to study and become nutritionists. It doesn't even come from the customers who go to the nutritionists. It comes from the money printer. It comes from Fiat credit allocation. It comes from the government allocating Fiat credit. And so basically, there's no mechanism for correcting that. As long as you get the funding, just like with schooling, as long as you're getting the funding from the government, as long as you're politically favored, as long as you can tick the right bureaucratic boxes to get the money, you keep getting the money no matter how much you fail on the market. In a free market, of course, it's different. You have to get people to willingly hand over money to you, and that only happens if you do something of value. But with Fiat, there's just Fiat means never having to say you're sorry. You control your own destiny in a sense that it's the Fiat institutions that allocate money to themselves, and they always decide that we're right and we need more money, and that anybody who disagrees with us is anti-scientific and doesn't need more money. Now, what would a proper scientist do to demonstrate a link between CO2 and any one particular problem? Well, they'd formulate a testable hypothesis of the impact of CO2, and they test the hypothesis against real-world data. So, for example, if CO2 emissions increase by X% over the period between year X and X plus 10, there will be no impact on bird populations or sea levels or temperature or whatever it is. This would be the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is there's no impact. And so therefore, you would say that if CO2 goes up by this much, you would not expect any significant change in temperature or sea levels or populations. And then you measure these and then you see, 10 years later, whether there is a change in a certain way. It's causing sea levels to rise. We see a sea level rise that coincided with that. Well, then you start doing more and more experiments. You start specifying the experiments more accurately to try and determine the relationship between it. But that's not what we have here. We just have a bunch of models. We can't run controlled experiments on the world generally, but climate people only do models. They just put some numbers in a computer and then they come up and they tell that computer to tell them what they want, and then they turn out, it's sock puppetry. Models in climate are sock puppetry. You tell the computer what you want, and then it tells you something, and then you go and parade that around as if you've discovered something. Oh, my computer said this. No, your computer said what you told it to tell you. You put in the numbers to get the answer that you want. Anyone can make any model that can tell them anything they want about anything. So modeling is completely nonsensical as a scientific tool, as a way of predicting or understanding what happens in the future. So we can't run controlled experiments, but we can look at the real world, and we can formulate hypotheses and look at how the world happens. And in 2020, we did have something close to a natural experiment, a controlled experiment, close to a controlled experiment, but it was a natural experiment. We did have, out of a sudden, the world was gripped by an insane hysteria, which got a lot of people to decide that, government needs to just lock everybody up at home just to be on the safe side. So it was an insane period in human history where people just went completely bananas. But the very valuable thing that it provided us is a very, very important test of the question of whether CO2 emissions, reducing CO2 emissions can have an impact on the climate. And lo and behold, it had no discernible impact on the climate. So basically, putting the entire world under house arrest, forcing everybody to keep their car in their garage, grounding vast majority of airplanes in the world and preventing them from flying, so much of the world's industrial infrastructure going offline because industrial production stopped, transportation, construction, so much of the world went offline, so much of the world's emissions stopped. What happened? Nothing. No discernible impact on climate, no discernible impact even on atmospheric CO2 concentrations, which I think is absolutely mind-blowing. I would not have expected this. So not only do we see that, as I think sane people would expect, like why would CO2 be the Earth's control knob? If we stop producing CO2, then the world's going to get cooler. We don't see any discernible cooling or any discernible effect. But also, we don't see a discernible effect on atmospheric concentrations. It seems the trend in the movement of atmospheric concentration has continued regardless of our emissions, which suggests that maybe we are not the CO2 control knob. So we do not determine the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. Maybe there are other factors we don't understand that determine how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And maybe CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere because of reasons beyond us. Maybe our emissions of CO2 aren't the driver. I don't know if that is the case, but I think if that was the case, you would have expected some kind of dent in the trend with which CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have been increasing. But no such trend exists. So we cannot dismiss the hypothesis that humans are having an impact on atmospheric CO2 concentrations and the climate. But the burden of proof is on the people making these extraordinary claims to present convincing evidence that illustrates the causal mechanisms involved, the likely impacts, the value of the mitigation measures they propose, and their true cost. This is the thing. You can't just keep shouting like a chicken little saying the world's going to end. What's going to end? What's going to be the problem? What happens? CO2 goes up, all right, then what happens? What is the problem? What is the damage? What are the implications? What are the impacts? How can it be fixed? And what is the impact of the solutions that you propose? Because I posit that your cure is far worse than the disease. I think that there is no disease in this case. I don't think CO2 is a problem for the planet. But I know for sure that the intervention that is being promised. That is what is being marketed as the disease. Let's just get rid of the technologies that have made the world livable for the past 500 years, are essentially mass genocide. If you're saying you want the world to go off fossil fuels and hydrocarbons fuels, you're essentially saying you would like somewhere in the range of 6-7 billion people to die. I mean, there's just no way that we can have this enormous amount of people on Earth without these modern technologies. We can have a lot more people on Earth, but we need technology. We need the modern technologies that have made this level of development possible. So if we want to get rid of that, you have to understand what you're proposing as the cure is, let's kill 6-7 billion people. So it would have to be an extremely convincing and extremely serious problem to justify this as a cure. You don't think that your cure is killing 6-7 billion people. Most hysterics think of the world as being just completely detached from physical reality and thermodynamics. So they just think government can just pass a law that says we continue to have everything that we have, but we do it without oil. If you have ever tried to build or design anything in your life with physical substances, that's not how the world works. It's a lot more complicated. So the onus of proof is on the people who are telling us that we need to do something that's going to kill a lot of people, that's going to destroy the infrastructure that makes our modern world possible. We're going to destroy the ability to have a steel industry. We're going to destroy our ability to build modern homes that withstand the winter. We're going to destroy our ability to travel. We're going to destroy our ability to have 24/7 electricity reliably. We're going to make everything that we have infinitely more expensive than what it is right now. We're going to essentially get rid of the last 200 years of technology. The entire digital revolution is impossible without hydrocarbons. And the notion that we'll find substitutes is ridiculous. Just look at the way in which semiconductor chips are manufactured, and look at how much coal has to go into their manufacture, and then talk about the alternatives. There is no alternative. The alternative to it is we go back to abacuses. The fossil fuel free version of a computer is your abacus. So you can't have your Apple computer, you can't have your iPhone if you don't want fossil fuels on them. Without testable hypotheses, the entirety of modern climate science is at best conjecture, but more likely motivated reasoning in search of a predetermined conclusion to secure more funding. Without testable hypotheses, climate scientists ought to be far humbler and more modest about whatever conclusions they arrive at. Don't expect that to happen anytime soon. The threats of climate change are an ever-shifting set of vague hypothetical threats of doom, while the threat from transitioning of energy sources from reliable hydrocarbons to unreliable renewables is a matter of life and death for billions on the planet. Again, if we want to look at the evidence, this is the CO2 concentration level at the Mauna Loa Observatory. This is data from NASA, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And it shows, this is the trend. This is what's happening with CO2 emissions. And here, early 2020, it looks exactly like every other year. It's just continued the same trend. Nothing is different between all these years. Nothing changed between these years. In fact, if you zoom out, you look at the trend from the 1960s, nothing has changed. So if shutting down the planet for many months won't even cause a dent in atmospheric concentrations of CO2, doesn't that call into question the idea that we need to essentially commit economic suicide and destroy modern civilization and destroy 500 years of technological advancement and sacrifice billions of people's lives? I mean, aren't you even a little bit hesitant to go ahead with this insanity? Oh yeah, let's get rid of the energy sources that we need, when we don't even see anything to suggest that that even shutting down the planet is going to cause CO2 emissions to decline. I mean, we see it. It's very similar in all of those years, whether you have a shutdown or not. So we've already tried the solution to climate change. We've already tried a solution which was, it was devastating. The lockdowns destroyed the lives of millions of people around the world and impoverished billions around the world, and still made no dent in CO2. So what are we expected to do? I mean, should we just basically kill 90% of humanity and see what happens, and see then if that causes a dent in CO2 and then that gives us better weather or something? And in fact, the real issue here is not only is the case that we're finding the link between our emissions and CO2 to be very little, to be very vague. We also don't really know if the link between CO2 and temperature is really all that causal. So it really is increasing the level of CO2 in the atmosphere really going to be like a thermostat for humanity to control the temperature of the Earth? That's not very clear. But more importantly, if really CO2 was such a villain and it was destroying the climate and it was creating all these crises, wouldn't we be expected to notice people dying somewhere, some bad things happening because of all of these climate crises? Well, we don't. If you look historically, you look at emissions of CO2. So if we look at what has happened to emissions, it's in this light gray line. Emissions of CO2 have gone up enormously over the last century and the last 120 years here. And over the last century, we see the deaths from climate-related causes, which means, any person dying from something that is caused by a climate disaster. So flooding, hurricanes, etc. All of these numbers of deaths are declining to less than 10% of what they were a century ago. Why is that the case? They're declining because of the use of modern technology, because of the emissions of CO2. This is not a completely spurious correlation here. We see CO2 is going up because we're using a lot of modern energy sources. We're using diesel, we're using gasoline, we're using gas and oil, gas and coal, and we're using these hydrocarbon energies which are constantly emitting CO2, and they're allowing us to build better infrastructure. They're allowing us to build safer homes. They're allowing us to build better flood control. They're allowing us to protect ourselves from all kinds of problems that climates could cause, and that's allowing us to survive better. A hurricane that hits a city 100 years ago was going to cause a lot more damage than it does today. But we have a lot more people living in areas that suffer from natural damage today, and yet they survive much better because of our use of modern technology. People survive storms today while watching Netflix at home, not feeling anything, when 100 years ago their grandparents would have been scrambling for survival during these storms, or 200 years ago this would have been, life or death. Are we going to make it? Today you just sit on a couch, watch Netflix while the world outside goes crazy. So climate is killing fewer people precisely because of the use of modern fuels and the technologies they enable. Hydrocarbons are not destroying Earth's climate. They are allowing us to survive it better. In other words, what we have here are like two competing visions of how humans deal with the weather. We have sane, rational human beings who believe, I'm going to use my brain and use all the tools at my disposal to protect myself from the weather and the climate and the earth, because I can't control the sun, I can't control the clouds, I can't control the earth. These things are far beyond my ability to control, but I can't control myself. I can protect my body, so I can build a house, I can build infrastructure around my house to protect it from flooding and from all kinds of other things. So I will protect myself, and in order to do that, I need energy, I need resources, I need materials that I need to move around. I'm going to need to do a lot of work, and in order to do that, I'm going to have to utilize hydrocarbon energy sources, because they're what make modern civilization possible. So there's the sane, rational way of approaching the weather, which is let's build homes that can withstand the storms, and let's build infrastructure that can allow us to remain happy and productive and safe during the worst storms. And then there's the completely insane view, which is, no, we're going to give up on all of these technologies that allow us to survive, that allow us to brace the natural world, because if we give up on them, then that will magically change the composition of the entire atmosphere surrounding the Earth, and then that will magically give us better weather, and then we won't have to worry about the weather. I mean, there's almost an insane naivety here of thinking of Earth as being just this very safe thing that is embracing for us, and that if we just stop being greedy and stop trying to make money and stop acting and stop burning things and stop doing all of these economic things that we do, then Earth would just open up for us and it would be safe, and life would be good. No, if we don't work, we starve, we die. If we don't run for survival every day, we get eaten by wild animals and we get bitten by insects and snakes and pests. Life is difficult for us and for all living things. You have to struggle every day. And it's delusional to imagine that we can just change that by giving up on the struggle. It's insane. Stop using all of the tools that you need for survival, and then that will fix the weather, and then that will make things better. Essentially, I think, the way that I like to describe it is the eternal adolescents of Fiat want to live in modern homes. They want to easily survive winters. They travel faster than walking. They want to use modern electronic devices and medical equipment and have electricity on demand. But they don't want to use the substance that makes all of these possible. I mean, you may not like it, but all of these things are only possible because of those substances. If you don't like it, go ahead and try and build an alternative. I mean, this is the challenge I give to people who are so upset about hydrocarbons and people who use hydrocarbons. Go and try and live without them first, and then tell us how you suggest we live without them. Don't just tell us to live without them, because living without them is just essentially suicide. I can't live without hydrocarbons. I would die. I don't think I would survive next winter if I didn't have hydrocarbons. So don't ask me to give them up until you show me how you can survive for one winter without it. Hydrocarbons are basically the only reason most of our modern life is possible. Working alternatives cannot be conjured by Fiat, and the only realistic alternative is grinding poverty and a precarious existence. Nobody stops you from stopping consuming oil. You choose to consume it because you need it to survive. You consume them because you need them to obtain modern things. Alternative energy sources are completely uneconomical without subsidies for very good reason. People wouldn't use them. People would just buy oil. It's a much cheaper, much more efficient way to do it. Now, to understand why renewables and alternative energy fuels are so expensive and uneconomical, I think it's very important to really think with the economic toolkit, with the way that we think as economists, of the market for energy and the market for power. So people think that it's a market for energy. It's about providing, we need to have a certain amount of energy in order to make the economy work, in order to make an economic activity take place. But we don't need sums of energy. As an individual, you don't need a total amount of energy. In the same way that you don't need a total sum of water for you to consume throughout all of your life. You need water or energy in certain quantities at certain times. And when you buy them, you're always buying them at the margin. You're buying the next unit in the place where you need it at the time that you need it. You can't just sign up for a lifetime subscription for, say, water and then receive water anytime you want it, anywhere you want it. You have to buy it at the particular points and times, or secure it for yourself at the particular points in time that you need it. The same is true for energy. So the sun obviously contains infinitely large amounts of energy that we cannot even fathom. And the amount of energy that from the sun that falls on Earth every day is larger than the amount of energy that all of humanity consumes in a year. So there's an enormous amount of energy coming from the sun. It's not very useful for you if you try to turn on your car, because that energy is not going to be able to move the wheels of your car at the time that you need them right now. There's no easy way to take the sunlight and get it to move your car, right? So what you need is a large amount of energy over a short burst of time. So you can have a large amount of energy fall on your car. You leave your car for a week in the sun. It's going to get a lot of energy fall on it. It's enough energy falls on it to make it move a lot of distance. I don't know the numbers, but it'll probably move many kilometers on the energy that it gets in just sitting in the sun for a week. But you can't take that energy and make it into moving the car unless you build the proper infrastructure that will transform that. You need solar photovoltaic cells, take that energy, put it in a battery, put the battery in the car, and have that energy
go from the battery to moving the wheels. So it's meaningless to say solar energy is free or wind energy is free because the wind is free and the sun is free, because the wind and the sun on their own aren't going to move your car. They aren't going to run your laptop. They aren't going to build steel factories. They need to be condensed into high power. It's not about how much energy the sun has. It's not about how much energy the wind contains. It's about how much energy can you give me to meeting my specific need at this specific point. When I turn on my car at 8 a.m. in the morning, when I flick the switch to turn the car on, I need a large amount of energy to go into getting the wheels moving. How can I secure that amount of energy at that specific period of time? That's the market for energy. It's not about how much energy the sun can throw on my car. It's about how much energy I can move into the wheels at the time that I want it. And so this is marginal analysis. And not enough people think of energy in terms of marginal analysis. They think of it as just an aggregate good. That, we need to buy energy. We need a lot of energy. The sun has infinite free energy. Let's just get all the free energy from the sun. It doesn't work that way. It's not about the quantities of energies. It's not about the quantities of energy. It's about the ability to move, to direct large amounts of energy over short bursts of time. You want that energy to go into the wheel and this second in very large doses in order to get the wheel to move. So power is understood at energy over time. And really, the market for energy, I think, should more accurately be known as the market for power, because you're not really just buying energy in the aggregate. You're buying energy per unit of time. You're buying this much energy per unit of time. This is how much work you can get done in a specific unit of time. So we don't have a need for energy in the abstract, in the aggregate. We have a need for power at the margin. And so total free sunlight is irrelevant to our high power needs. What we need is high doses of power. So as a form of energy in the abstract, solar is infinitely cheap. But as an economic good that meets our need for power, solar energy requires highly sophisticated and expensive equipment to become usable, and that is why it remains far more expensive as a source of energy than hydrocarbons and continues to require subsidies, mandates, and subsidized fiat credit. So yes, the sun is free, and it's never going to become less than free. But that's not the bottleneck in the cost of solar panels, in the cost of solar energy. The bottleneck is the solar technology, the solar photovoltaic technology that's going to take this very low density energy that is low power, because it's small amounts of energy over long periods of time, and try and convert it into high bursts of energy over short periods of time. That's the difficult thing. That's what's really expensive. And that's what makes all of these renewable energy sources enormously expensive, much more than hydrocarbon fuels, because they're not there when you need them. They are just not there when you need them. So on top of that, also, they cannot be built without hydrocarbons. So it's not an alternative, really. In other words, if you can't call solar panels and wind turbines an alternative to hydrocarbons if they cannot be built without hydrocarbons. It's not an alternative for it. I find a better way of referring to that is that it is hydrocarbon laundering. Instead of using the hydrocarbons to just make the engines move around or in order to generate electricity, you use the hydrocarbon to create the solar panel and then move the solar panel and then have the solar panel produce the electricity. And as long as the solar panel is not economical without subsidies, as long as you need government subsidies and incentives in order to make the solar panel generate electricity, then arguably this is thermodynamically inefficient. If it was efficient to do it that way, then it would be the thing that people would do. Anyway, if it was cheaper to use fossil fuels to make solar panels and then put a solar panel on everything and then everybody would have energy, that would be what people would do. But people don't do it because you can't just rely on solar panels, because you need energy 24/7. So you need a battery. And then when you put it through a battery, it becomes enormously expensive. So therefore, there are no alternatives to fossil fuels. There are no alternatives to hydrocarbon. The only proven alternatives to hydrocarbons are poverty, cold, disease, and darkness. And the important thing here is that, you could think of this, all right, well, this is just another stupid fiat grift. This is what I used to think when I first learned about this stuff. I did my PhD on this nonsense.
And after looking into it, I realized, wow, yeah, it's just a stupid excuse for a bunch of rich people to get very rich. So there was a guy called T. Boone Pickens who made a lot of money on renewable energy scam subsidies. And a lot of these people continue until today. And initially, I thought, well, this is just another stupid scam. People are hyperventilating about something, scaring people about CO2. And then they get these people to vote for politicians that give them money and subsidies and fiat loans so that they could save us from bad weather. Well, who cares? So initially I thought this was just not interesting. It's just silly. But then over time, as time went by, I started to realize this is actually extremely dangerous. It's not just a bunch of hucksters that are going to get rich. People like Al Gore and T. Boone Pickens and so on. No. These people, in order to keep this stupid grift going, are essentially threatening the entirety of modern industrialized human civilization. They are basically reversing the Industrial Revolution. I don't know if they think of it that way, but this is what they're doing. Fiat people are essentially so attached from reality that they don't really understand the gravity of the situation. I mean, it's like we're on an airplane and people are voting to get rid of the wings. They've decided, you know what, the wings are too heavy. We can save on fuel by getting rid of the wings, and then the airplane will be lighter, or getting rid of the engine. And this is where we are. I mean, there are cheaper ways of committing suicide. Just jump from the airplane and let it continue to work. If you or just don't get on airplanes, or get off on the next stop. But if you want to be on an airplane, you need wings. That's just the technology that we have. Build an airplane without wings and then tell us about the drawbacks of wings. But what we're seeing now is rich countries are witnessing power become much more expensive. You see this in Germany, you see it in Britain, you see it in California, you see it in many, many places. Places that in the 50s, 60s, 70s had 24/7 reliable electricity are now having blackouts, becoming more and more regular, and grids are becoming less and less reliable. And of course, this is the problem in rich countries. So we're seeing the reversal of industrialization. We're witnessing the opposite in those rich countries. And really, historically, I mean, economics and economic progress is really, you could think of it as the reduction in the cost of energy. As our income increases, we command more energy. If you look around the world today, the richest countries spend the most energy, the poorest countries spend the least energy. Historically, as our living standards improve, the amount of energy that we consume improves. Energy is the best proxy for a living standard. The more energy you have, the more you can act on the world to impose your will and get what you want and protect yourself from bad things happening to you. So all our lives, all of our history, we're just making energy less and less expensive by finding cheaper ways of generating energy, by finding new fuels that add energy to our life. Historically, if you want to understand economic progress and how it changes human lives, think of it this way. Historically, the average person used to command roughly the energy of themselves to meet their needs. You have your body, and you had to use your body in order to command all the energy sources that you bring in, that you use to meet your needs. So you had to chop your own woods. If you wanted warm water, you had to chop wood and you had to burn it, and then you had to boil the water, and that would make you hot water. With the invention of modern technology, hot water is available for you at a flick of a switch. You pay a very tiny small amount at the end of the month to have electricity that heats the water, and then you flick the switch and then the hot water comes out. So the cost of making hot water has declined enormously because of our use of modern energy technology. The cost of lighting has declined enormously. And in my next book, Principles of Economics, I have a detailed and lengthy discussion of energy from this regard, which I highly recommend to go along with this discussion in this book. That the cost of energy just continues to drop as we progress, as we make better things, as our lives become better, as they become more productive, we just get cheaper energy. And what we're seeing in the last 10, 20 years is a return to more expensive energy. We're seeing the cost of energy go up over time. We're seeing the cost of energy rise, and so we're seeing people's standard of living decline. We're witnessing the reverse of the Industrial Revolution in rich countries. And in poor countries, the insane green hysteria is preventing industrialization, is preventing those countries from using the essential energy sources that have built the modern world and forcing them to remain on inefficient, unsustainable, and economically devastating failed substitutes and alternatives, because these are what rich donors find fashionable. So the result is, I think, devastating, because it has reduced the amount of energy that we consume since the 1970s. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there has been a constant trend of 2% annual growth in the kilowatts per capita consumption. So every person on average on Earth consumes 2% more energy per year than they consumed the year before. And this is held since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until the 1970s. Once we got to the 1970s, that trend broke, and now we're basically stuck at around the same level as we were in the 1960s and 70s in terms of kilowatt per capita. So the increase in the energy that we consume has declined, has stopped, and I think we're seeing this reflected in many, many ways. I think aviation is another great way of seeing where this decline shows up. Commercial aviation today is slower than in the 1960s and 70s. I've done a study on this, and I've looked at timetables for airplanes in the 60s and 70s, and they used to be faster than what they are now. Supersonic jets are no longer commercially available. And the speed record for military jets, this fastest airplane to ever travel, the speed record has not been broken since 1976. The fastest flight ever was recorded in 1976, so 46 years ago was the fastest flights. In the last 46 years, nobody was able to go faster than this record. And the jet that did this, the SR-71, was decommissioned, and whatever replacements we have are nowhere near as fast as it. So we are objectively regressing in aviation. We are regressing in terms of the growth of our energy per capita. And I think this is enormously devastating for humanity as a civilization. Because if human progress in the past 2 centuries had come through the steady exponential increase of energy consumption, one can only wonder what progress we have missed out on from the increasing costs of energy and the stunting of our consumption of it. When you think of just how much better life would be if everybody could consume a lot more energy, if we'd continued to increase at about 2% per year since the 1970s, think about how much better everybody's lives would be. Think, the people who live in the world's poorest countries would have a living standard similar to today's middle-income countries. And people in middle-income countries would have a living standard probably similar to people in rich countries. And people in rich countries would have a living standard beyond what we take for possible today. Like average people would have the things that millionaires would have. Maybe with so much more energy consumption, maybe flying cars would have been a realistic thing by now. Aviation would have been infinitely faster and cheaper than what it is right now. Imagine if the progress that we had up until the 1970s had continued. Aviation could have continued to get faster and more efficient. So I think, arguably, what Fiat has done is that it has reduced our ability to increase our energy consumption, and it has marketed this. I think the really nefarious thing is that it has marketed this to people as if it's a good thing, that you want to reduce the amount of energy that you consume, and it's basically trying to convince us that the solution to progress, the way we progress, is to consume less and to live a worse life, rather than to continue to improve our lives. That, I think, is the problem of Fiat, and I think the cost in terms of the energy in the world has been absolutely devastating.